manager that has an asset orientation and say, I have a person that's at 50% capacity in terms of knowledge, I need to give them more. Because I'm paying them the same amount of money no matter what. So they don't see training as an asset, as an investment. And then the burden falls on that manager to get the return. And it's a very different way in which you manage. It's a very different orientation. And I think it leads to this idea of talent management generating innovation. Yes, please.
Do you have some thoughts on how to help human resources executives to feel comfortable and confident in triggering those strategic business questions and having the opportunity to ask them?
Yes. For me, if you can, I start here. The other thing that I think is, I work in a business school. And maybe my dean wouldn't be happy if I say this, but I think we've contributed to the problem because the way we tend to teach people in business schools is from a very functional perspective. Like we teach people finance problems, accounting problems, management problems, operations problems. But when you talk to business leaders, they don't think about things that way at all. They have really one problem, customer problems. Either they can't get enough of them, or they can't deliver what they want fast enough. And if finance people can help them solve that, fine, we'll talk about finance. If accounting people can help them solve that, fine, we'll talk about accounting. And if the HR person can help them solve that, well, I'll listen to you as well. It's interesting, they don't discriminate from where they get help. They don't care. Whoever can help them is fine. And what I find is a distinction between sort of the HR people that can do this and that can't do this is that the HR person that can't, we'll talk to them about, we really have a great idea on a new performance management system. And it is world class, it is really best, and we can do this with minimal execution costs. And the top executive will go, I got customer problems. And while we like to think about internal customers, that's nonsense. A customer is a person that pays you. If you pay them, they're not a customer. They're an employee. I know we talk about being good but at the end of the day, from your perspective of your organization, if they're not paying you, they're not a customer. And so when we talk about a performance management system and we only focus on implementing that performance management system, we're not doing ourselves service, because if you go to the executive and say, well, the reason why you're having difficulty with this customer is the customer has a need for service, and we don't evaluate people on providing that service, so our people don't do it. And if you give me this money, this will be the increase in behavior that leads to a sale. As soon as you start talking like that, the CEO or the COO will say, well, you got a few minutes? That sounds interesting. Because now you were talking about creation of value. And you can't do that if you don't have the ability to focus on these things. It just isn't possible. Like if you're thinking about internal systems all the time, then what you're going to focus on is how to improve internal systems. And again, I'm not saying it's bad. That will generate increases in profitability with single digits. You can just squeeze a little more water out of that rock. But double-digit growth is understanding that you just have a new customer base. And man, you know what? I happen to know some stuff now that these customers like. Thank goodness the environment changed. So those are the type of people that I think have that type of conversation. And they say, oh, I want to sit at the table. I want to have a strategic point of view. Listen, you just know what the customers want. And at the end of the day, that's the thing that adds value. And you're able to link that because of your HR expertise. You're able to link what the customers want to competencies in your people, to practices that allow that to occur more often than not. Just like the finance person because listen, I talk to a lot of CEOs about their CFOs as well. And just because they know a lot about numbers doesn't make them strategic. It just makes them confusing. But, a lot of CFOs actually do not have much influence. They are glorified bank tellers. Right? They tell me how much I do a withdrawal, I do a deposit. Because they don't actually understand how their ability to manipulate financial capital generates value for customers. So I don't think it's unique to us. I don't feel the least bit ashamed to be an HR professional because my other professionals aren't getting it right either. But the people who get this right, regardless of function, they start here and they're able to talk about how a change in the environment translates over into a competency, which translates over into why I should or should not have a policy. So that's my perspective. If you're struggling with that conversation with a leader in your organization, it's because most leaders don't think about HR problems. They think about customer problems. And if HR can help you solve a customer problem, they'll listen to you. And they'll give you money. And a promotion. So, and if you can't solve customer problems, you become a really good line HR manager. Which is fine, but I don't think it actually generates the most value for you as a professional or as an organization. Yes, please.
A while back, there was a popularity around skunk work. What do you think about highly specialized groups that are pulled together? And should the HR people have a role with those?
For me, HR, anything dealing with people, this is another, I think, this is another testimony as to where HR sits within the organization. Because anything dealing with people, that's HR. That's like saying, and if you have an HR function that is excluded from the hiring of a particular group of experts or a particular group, what that suggests is there's a lack of confidence in the HR entity. Because the CFO gets to deal with all the money. There's not like a pool of money that they don't get to deal with. That doesn't make any sense. And they get to deal with that because of the expectation of competency. So I think the HR should have a role. Now, in terms of skunk works as a mechanism to drive innovation, I think what you're seeing is some interesting trends. So there was a time where you saw particularly large organizations commit large dollar amounts to R&D groups of some sort. And they basically would take these experts and say, listen, here's some money, just go off and think about some stuff, and every now and then, just slide something underneath the door that I can go to market with. And it worked. But what you found over time was a few things. One, the cost became prohibitive because there were a lot of false positives, ideas that the engineers or technical people were coming up with that just had no market value, and it was very expensive to go through this. The other thing was speed to market became a competitive advantage. So it wasn't just about having something that nobody else had, it was about having that and also being able to deliver that in a very timely manner. And so if you gave me a bunch of ideas and I had to sort through it and figure out which ones were good or bad, and then I had to figure out how to make it, and then I had to figure out how to sell it, that just made me very slow. And so what I've noticed is a trend where organizations are much more likely to combine, not segment those groups anymore, to make it much more multidisciplinary, to have those engineers work at very early phases in the development process with the operations, with the marketing, with these other entities, to identify the ideas that have the greatest amount of promise earlier, which reduces the cost, but also makes it faster to get that out. Now, the HR story around that is, I need a different type of engineer. Right? Because I need a technical expert, but also at least has the ability to have a conversation with a marketing person. And that's a different skill set, that's a different competency. And so training, we tend to have focused on training those people who are the experts to get better and deeper in their particular domain without any thought around breadth. But if harnessing is actually a distinguishing factor between success and failure, it does make sense to give those individuals what we would typically think of as more generic business skills, because what it allows them to do is work more effectively with other parts of the organization. And so that's a trend that I think we're seeing, where you're having the use of multidisciplinary teams at very early phases in any developmental process, whether it's with product or service. And I gave the example of Apple earlier and how they have these multidisciplinary reviews. And I think this is just an illustration of that point. It wasn't just about having someone come up with the best idea and then figuring out what to do with it. It was about having something that was doable. And that required multiple forms of information, and that meant having that done earlier. So I see organizations still have them, but I think this trend of segmenting them away is becoming less and less. It's too expensive and it's too slow. Other questions or thoughts about this topic? Is this issue of having a sort of a strategic impact in your organization, is this an issue that you see? Being able to shape the strategy of the organization? You know, I oftentimes tell people, for me, I think HR plays a role in shaping the strategy, but I think their bigger role, HR is really about implementation of strategy, because people implement. And I oftentimes say, and maybe it's just a bailout on my part, but when I'm working with a company, I said everything that we're talking about is predicated on the fact that you actually have a good strategy. Because if you have a very bad strategy, like you're not picking up on the opportunities that make good sense, I can't really help you. I may make you fail in a very elegant manner, but you're going to fail. I mean, and so I think there is a role for strategy to be decided here, but the thing that I think about for an HR professional is the way I would think about a good lawyer. So if you go to a bad lawyer, you'll tell them about your problem, and that lawyer will tell you, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And you sit there going, well, man, you told me all the things not to do, but I still haven't solved the problem. And oftentimes I think you have a compliance-oriented HR type of situation where they talk to you about what you can't do. And a good lawyer is a good counsel, is where the person goes to that individual and says, this is my problem, and the lawyer says, well, these are your options, these are the likelihoods of success associated with each of those options, and this is how much they're going to cost. You get to pick, but once you pick, I'll implement it to the greatest degree. And I think when you have an HR department that can focus on it in that way, they generate a lot more value. Right? This is really taking on the professional responsibility of being the bearer of all things associated with human and social capital in your organization. No one should know more about that than us. If they do, that's problematic. And it's really hard for them too. Like our line managers really do want to look to us for that advice. They really do want us to be their guided counsel in that particular situation. But that just means, one, we have to really have our HR skill sets down. There's no room for that. We have to be really good at that. But we also have to be able to appreciate how that is grounded in the broader domain of our customers. And that second part is where I see a lot of variance in organizations. Yes, please.
I have a question. Looking at or rolling back through the history of Apple, do you realize their success, their knowledge? Do you realize their success to their knowledge and their innovation or to their strategy?
I do think that they have made some important decisions about how they manage people. I do think that their leader showed the opportunity recognition skill sets that differentiated from other leaders. He was able to get the organization to focus as opposed to have a whole bunch of scattering of opportunities. So if you look at Sony, for example, Sony will sell you 30 different digital music players. And when you go into their catalog, you're like, what's the difference between number 1 and number 30? Like what? Like why is one $50 more? Why is it? Like it's confusing. And it's because they have all these different divisions that the organization has not focused to have any discipline. And Apple sells you one in 2 colors. And it works. And a whole bunch of people buy it because it makes sense. And that's because the CEO and the leadership was able to create a discipline in the organization. And that's a skill set. That's a competency. So I think there is something to be said for that being a competency and a characteristic of the organization that differentiates it. And that's both strategy but also implementation. I also firmly believe that they were lucky, because if they had launched their product, I mean, let's be clear, the iPod saved them, right? I mean, that was like because it was a channel by which they got everything else flowing. The iPhone, the iPad, the Apples, the computers, the Macs, they already had the Macs. People weren't buying them, so that wasn't the issue. And what happened was that they were in a situation where their competitors created an opportunity by cutting back their R&D dollars and not offering new products and waiting. And this is because there was a recession happening, and they didn't have the luxury of doing that, so they did. So I think there's a little bit of luck that happened around that. And for me, I look at Apple the same way I look at Microsoft and the same way I look at Google. Right? Because if you go back 5 years, the the glory organization was Google. If you go back 15 years, it was Microsoft. And you see these organizations go through this cycle where they mature, they have a product offering, they have huge market share in one offering, and then they have to figure out how to grow, and they struggle. Now, Apple's been somewhat successful because they kind of branched out a little bit, and iTunes is probably the biggest thing that illustrates that. But, how well can they actually continue that over time? And I contrast these stories with IBM, which is not sexy. Nobody talks about it, but it's a high technology company that's been in business for over 100 years selling high technology. They started off selling vacuum tubes, and they're still relevant. That, for me, is a far more compelling story. Because this is an organization that was able to see a change in the external environment, particularly around cost and purchasing of PCs and laptops, and say, we know a whole lot about computing. We make computers, but we're never going to be competitive going forward about making computers, so we got rid of that. Despite the fact that we have the history of doing this, and it became a service organization. That, for me, is great leadership. That's opportunity recognition, that's complementary knowledge, that's combination. And I look at them and go, it is not, Microsoft hasn't shown the ability to do that. I mean, they've struggled with that. And Google, I wonder what they'll be able to do, and I'm curious to see what Apple will be able to do around it. And so I think there's clear advantages of that organization, but I also appreciate that, they were fortunate in some ways as well. Other thoughts or reactions? Other questions? Yes, please.
I would love to see breakthroughs in organization charts, structures. I think with most companies, when they grow up, usually they lose the entrepreneurship spirit.
Yes.
And then they build those giant, titles, organization charts, which cripples the speed of the innovation. I would love to see a model of innovative organization chart of which people can just talk to each other, no silos, and the more we grow, the more we put silos into place, the more we have fancy titles, the more we have lots of crippling to those. I wonder how the HR or the corporate world can solve such a problem in the future, because it takes like 100 years to grow a company, it takes like overnight to collapse.
What you say is so true. And if you don't believe that, this is maybe homework that I would give you, and I'll put my professor hat. Go look at the 2000 Fortune 500 list. Right? The Fortune puts out these 500 largest companies in the world. Go look at that list, and go look at the 2010 Fortune 500 list, or the 2012 Fortune 500 list. You will be amazed at how many companies that were on the list 10 years ago are not on the list now. And they're not on the list because they're smaller. A lot of them are on the list because they're gone. And they don't exist anymore. And what we know is that we talk about the liability of being small as a startup. But there's a very clear liability of being old and large. And what it causes is inertia. It makes it much more difficult for you to answer these questions and react upon them. And so being large as an organization is not a guarantee of success at all. Very few organizations make it 100 years, period. They just don't. It's because the leader or the founder makes it 50 years, and it takes another 50 years for everybody to forget what the founder was talking about in the first place. And that's just the reality. Just go look at the list, you'll be amazed. The other aspect around this, in terms of how HR, I think, can help overcome these liabilities of size or liabilities of age, we need to think a little more broadly about, or creatively about, the metrics we use. So I do think that one of the ways you can overcome this liability is effective communication. But we don't measure communication. We measure what people know. We give tests. But we don't measure communication. And it's not because there aren't tools available. So one thing I might do with the organization is actually use social networking tools to actually map out the relationships that exist in organizations, because things get done through relationships. And if social capital generates value, then I need to actually be able to measure that like I would measure other types of assets. And it's possible. It's completely doable. We know how to do it. I think it is underutilized in organizations because there hasn't been exposure to it. And if I know what are the effective channels, then I empower my managers to support those and reward those. Right? To reward the types of people that you talk to. And I don't think enough strategically about that. So for me, I think that's one way where we can overcome it. That's one advantage, because the liability of being small is you don't have the capacity. The liability of being old is you have the capacity, but you cannot implement because it gets bogged down. Effective networks help overcome that. So that's one idea I have about ways in which organizations can do that more effectively. And there's pretty strong theory as well as consulting practice around doing it. Yes?
You said a few times about competency, accountants know numbers, and HR know people, so on and so forth. Is it really the fact that there's all these competency silos, or is it maybe an attitude that you don't know what I know, and therefore you can't do it or can't understand?
I think the really good leaders don't think about it that way, and they get the breadth of exposure, right? The best HR person I've ever met in terms of the executive was somebody that came out of finance, right? They understood the theory of human behavior, and they can map that on the dollars. And this person was extraordinarily effective and very influential. And they just thought about it because they said, I need money to make the product, and I need people to do it as well, so let me understand both, right? And so I think the good people are able to overcome that. But this is where I look at my profession as an academic, and I say we need to really evolve around this, because we're not training people to do things that way, right? And even the way we do training and development organizations, so we think about like training people generic negotiation skills, and there's tremendous value in doing it, right? And it's a skill and it matters. But the application of that skill set does not happen. It happens in a commercial reality. And so just making sure that we do that in a way that is automatically associated with the financial, accounting, or marketing reality gets people thinking, this is not a negotiation problem, this is a vendor problem, which allows me to have a customer. And I need to be able to understand the market reality, but also negotiation simultaneously. And part of that is we just don't frame it that way. And part of that is that you have experts in domains that aren't necessarily skilled to do it that way. So one of the things that I've been doing the last few years is I've been co-teaching classes with accounting professors. And, I was very nervous about doing this because I don't really know a lot about accounting. And, whether I'm going to figure this out or not. But what I began to realize very early on was my students love this, because it allowed them to see how everything fit together. And when the accounting professor says you cannot calculate ROA on a person, and I get up there and say people are assets, and they watch us argue in the front of the room about why that is, and then we both realize there's some opportunities there that the students can then figure out, that is really great learning. And it took me sort of saying, let me step into an arena where I know I'm not competent, or there's others that are better than me, and be willing to sort of learn around that, but also be willing to challenge the application of what is HR, which is the knowledge of human motivation. And be okay with saying that's valid in all situations. And also, the same thing is true for accounting. And one thing that I really appreciated with this exchange, and I've been doing this now for about 2.5 years, accounting people know how to measure everything. Like in HR, we talk about how do you measure stuff. Like they know how to measure everything. And it just dawned on me like, well, wait a second, why are we trying to figure this out? Just ask them. They do this all the time. We trust them with our books. They measure everything. So, I think there's some expertise there. So I think the evolution of innovation will be for companies and universities to do more of that. And I know we're trying to do more of that in our business school, where we're doing, 4 classes at the same time, all jumping to talk. It's a scary thought. But I think that that's the way to go, because it teaches people concepts in a commercial reality that's applicable. Yes, please.
Just to go back to Apple as a successful story, what's your view on their HR practice?
I think that their HR practice